Hello, we'll give it a few minutes for everyone to start entering. We're excited to have you with us today. Wonderful. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Meeks, and I am the Executive Director of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative, and I'm an Associate Professor of Learning Health Sciences and Family Medicine at the University of Michigan. I want to welcome you to the first in a three-part series of webinars designed to assist DRPs, so probably many of you, and other medical school faculty and staff as you assist students as they navigate the accommodation request process. We are so grateful today to the Docs with Disabilities Initiative AIM program, so that's our Access in Medicine program, and the University of Michigan Center for Disability Health and Wellness for their generous support of this series. We are really excited to bring you this series and the much anticipated updated guide. It seems like it's taken forever, which will be released at the conclusion of these webinars. The original guide was crafted by Dr. Nara Jain and me, and was originally created for our students in our work at the University of California, San Francisco. During this time, we were both DRPs, much like many of you in the audience, and we both experienced unprecedented success in obtaining accommodations for students with disabilities, due in part, I think, to the incredible support of the University of California, San Francisco, who hired us as full-time DRPs for medicine, where we often spent about 12 hours per student engaging with the student about their personal statement, their documentation, and checking in with the providers as needed to provide support to them as well. This dedicated time really created space for us to be diligent about meeting the NBME's stated requirements and ensuring that each point in the application was fully addressed. When questions came up, we also felt very empowered to reach out to the NBME, who quickly and fully responded to our questions and were really quite helpful. In addition to time, UCSF also removed an immense financial barrier for our students. They did this by funding testing and assessment as needed for students who would otherwise not be able to secure the necessary documentation. And I want to say that we recognize that this is a privilege and that not all institutions employ specialized DRPs, and that many of you that even are specialized DRPs are not afforded the time or the resources that Nira and I experienced. We shared our original guide with our DRP colleagues across the nation to provide support for the community and for our colleagues. And now 7 years later, we are offering an updated guide that's co-authored by many of the presenters in this series and reviewed and further informed by students with disabilities, which is a really important step in this updated guide. All right. So I want to offer a disclaimer really quickly. This webinar is really intended to provide general information about applying for accommodations on the USMLE Step Exams. This team, our team, is not affiliated with the NBME, and we don't represent or claim to represent the NBME in any manner. The NBME is the official arbiter of all accommodation decisions for the USMLE Step Series, and they are the ultimate authority. Questions beyond any of the general information we provide in this three-part series should really be directed to the NBME. We want to encourage you to reach out to them. They've always been responsive and helpful for me and for many of my colleagues, many of which are on today. And to be helpful with this webinar series, the NBME generously provided written responses to some of your most pressing questions. These questions and answers will be sprinkled throughout the series. Finally, I'd like to provide an equity statement, one that we have provided in the new guide. Dr. Jane and I have done a lot of reflection as we've gone through building this new guide, a new resource for you, and we remain concerned. We remain concerned about the inequities that exist prior to students getting to medical education. The lack of access to specialists, to diagnosis, to high quality documentation, to financial and educational resources for early identification of disability and supportive intervention. And in the provision of accommodations, both in medical school and on high stakes exams. We recognize that these inequalities are disproportionately affect students of color, those that are first generation to college, those that come from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. And we want to just acknowledge that these students are already entering medicine disadvantaged by a myriad of structural and cultural barriers that persist throughout their medical training and sometimes into practice. Our hope is that this guide provides DRPs and medical school leadership with one level of support for trainees. We want to encourage you, the audience, medical school leaders and DRPs, to take seriously the barriers posed by what we feel is an inherently privileged process, and to provide students with the maximum level of support possible. How do you do this? You provide specialized DRPs that have time to support students and funding to support students who otherwise cannot access resources. This support will increase students' chances of full and equitable access to the exam. It will decrease the intense burden on students with disabilities who are already balancing so much, including personal, family, social, health, and academic priorities. And please keep in mind that consultants, while helpful if hired by the school to support all students, may further perpetuate inequities, as not all students have access to this level of support. To further equalize access to assistance and knowledge and resources, we here at the Docs with Disabilities Initiative vow to make all of our resources, including this series, the new guide, a video, and some discrete training videos, free to you, to your students, and accessible to any user who wants to use them. Thank you so much for spending your hour with us today. And with that, I very proudly turn it over to our panel.
Hello and welcome, and thank you, Lisa. We are delighted to be kicking off this three-part webinar series with you today. This is part one of the National Board of Medical Examiners, or NBME, Accommodation Request webinar series, introducing the guide for requesting accommodations on the USMLE exams. I am Grace Clifford, and I'm the Director for Disability Services at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and I'll turn it over to my counterparts to introduce themselves. Aggie?
Hello, everyone. I'm Aggie McGrane. I'm an Associate Director with Northwestern University's Accessible NU office. I oversee accommodation determinations and implementation for students in Northwestern's professional degree programs, including our M.D. physical therapy and physician's assistant programs. And I'm excited to be here. Sue?
Hello, everyone. I'm Sue Nahm, the Director of Academic Support at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and I provide programming and resources to support student preparation for the USMLE exams, as well as general academic support to students at all stages of their undergraduate medical education. Happy to be here.
All right, and I think we're starting with Aggie.
To start us off, Sue will begin with an overview of the STEP exam structure and content, and then we'll provide an overview of the guide, including recommendations for use, requested and required documentation for the process, and common accommodations offered for the STEP exams. We'll conclude with a Q&A. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature, and any questions not addressed today will be saved and responded to in a fourth webinar that's currently under development.
Thanks, Aggie. So there are a few learning objectives for this webinar. We hope attendees will leave this session with the ability to, one, articulate the standard structure of the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 exams, Number 2, understand how to locate and how to utilize the USMLE exam accommodation requirements. And finally, number 3, describe common accommodations used on the USMLE Step Exams. Next slide. So first, we'll go over the structure of the USMLE exams. And it's really important that disability resource providers, or DRPs, are familiar with the structure and format of the exam to understand not only why accommodations may be needed, but also to be informed about potential ways to support students seeking specific types of accommodations. Next slide. So as some of you may already be aware, the Step 1 and Step 2 CK exams are the first 2 components of the United States Medical Licensing Exam, or USMLE, which is required for medical licensure in the United States. On the left, we see the Step 1 exam tests students' knowledge of the basic sciences, such as the principles and mechanisms underlying health, disease, and modes of therapy. It's organized along 2 dimensions, system and process. And this exam is typically taken after students have completed the preclinical curriculum. On the right, we see the Step 2 Clinical Knowledge Exam, or Step 2 CK for short, assesses a student's ability to apply medical knowledge, skills, and understanding of the clinical sciences. Now, this exam is typically taken after students have completed their clerkships before or during their 4th year or final year of medical school. So later on, we'll put in the Q&A a couple of links, including this one, with more information about the content of the exam for those of you who are interested. Next slide. All right, so under standard time, the Step 1 exam is an 8-hour exam session consisting of 7 one-hour blocks of up to 40 questions per block. Included in the 8-hour time frame is 45 minutes of break time, plus 15 minutes of an optional tutorial. Now, students can utilize up to 1 hour of break time if they watch the tutorial in advance of the exam and skip the tutorial the day of. The Step 2 CK exam is slightly longer than the Step 1 exam. As you can see, it's a 9-hour exam session with 8 one-hour blocks of up to 40 questions per block and up to 1 hour of break time if the student skips the 15-minute tutorial. So note that if a student ends a block early, this would be added to their overall break time. And it's important to note that the student watch the tutorial because it is available through the USMLE website. Instead of waiting until the day of the exam to watch the tutorial, students can do so before the exam date. Not only would they be able to skip the tutorial the day of or go through it quickly, which adds to their overall break time, but they will also be able to familiarize themselves with the various features of the exam ahead of exam day. Again, these are tips that can be very helpful when advising students about the exam and helping them decide on the appropriate accommodations. All right, next slide. So both the Step 1 and Step 2 CK exams consist of multiple choice questions with single item responses. Some questions may contain images, audio clips, and/or video clips. So students with certain types of disabilities, including those that are deaf, hard of hearing, or have low vision, may need to request accommodations to have full access to those images and/or audio clips. Because of the exam environment, any audio clip will require headphones, which will be provided by the Prometric Center where the exam is administered. Now, the tutorial provides an opportunity for students to test the audio and media interface before beginning the exam. And students should be encouraged to test it out before the exam. As mentioned before, they can do so before the day of the exam, and they can also do so during the exam. On the right side of the slide, you can see an image of the exam tutorial, as well as options provided to test the various control features for playing back audio and video clips. Next slide. Great. So to register for the Step 1 and Step 2 CK exams, students must first complete an online registration with the National Board of Medical Examiners, or the NBME. And during the online registration process, students will be prompted to select a 3-month eligibility window or a 3-month window within which they plan to take the exam. Then they'll be prompted to pay the registration fee online and submit a completed certification of identification form to their registrar or school official. Again, in the Q&A portion, we'll place in the chat a link that contains information on rescheduling fees for each of these exams. Now, once a student completes the registration process and the medical school certifies the student, the NBME will issue a scheduling permit via email with detailed instructions on how to schedule their exam. The final step is for students to schedule their exam at a Prometric exam center. So students may schedule their exam online with Prometric directly, but they can also call a 1-800 number located on the registration instructions. For registering, for students applying for accommodations, the registration process is similar, but we wanted to point out that during the online registration process, they will be asked whether they are applying for testing accommodations. Students will then be prompted to pay the registration fee, but will not receive a scheduling permit until after their accommodation request is reviewed and an accommodation determination is made. So although students must wait, usually, although the time varies, at least 60 business days for a response to their accommodation request, they will still need to pay for the exam upfront. As of now, the registration fee is $660, but the cost is set to increase to $670 in November 2023. Students should be made aware of the need to pay the registration fee upfront, since they may assume it's not required until after a decision is made regarding their accommodation request. Once the student's registration is complete and the fee for registration is paid, the student can then submit their STEP accommodation request. Instructions and forms for completing the application for testing accommodations can be found on the USMLE website, and we'll also share that link as well. Now, step 3 of the process is after about 60 to 90 days, again, this number can really vary, after the NBME has confirmed that they have received the student's accommodation packet, the student will then receive the official answer to their accommodation request. And once a response to the request for accommodations is received, a student can schedule their exam directly with the Prometric Exam Center. Note that the wait time may be longer if the NBME requests additional information or the student's application is deemed incomplete. Now, because there is a 2 to 3 month wait time potentially before students are able to schedule the exam, they should be advised to select a 3-month eligibility period that is at least 3 months out from their date of registration and the submission of their application for testing accommodations. Now, as a DRP, you can play an important role in setting expectations about the timeline and helping students identify a realistic window for scheduling their exam. When scheduling their exam, students applying for accommodations may find it beneficial to call the number provided on the scheduling instructions they receive instead of trying to schedule the exam online to identify maximal available options for testing. In some cases, students receiving accommodations may be directed to call to schedule their exam due to the nature of their accommodations and would be unable to schedule their exam online. So it should be noted that sometimes students can learn of additional options for testing that are not posted on the Prometric website. That's the key takeaway. At any time, note that if a student changes their mind about moving forward with their testing accommodations application, they may contact the NBME via email or phone to cancel their application for accommodations. The NBME will then remove the hold on their scheduling permit, and students can proceed with scheduling their exam with Prometric if they wish. So while this information may be available to students online, and some of you are already probably familiar with much of this information, we wanted to make sure you are aware that as a DRP, this information can be especially helpful as we're working with students, helping them make informed decisions about how to best navigate the registration and scheduling of their exam in real time.
Thanks. One of our questions to the NBME was related to scheduling. Specifically, we asked, students don't understand why they must wait to schedule a test date until NBME's Disability Services responds. They feel this puts them at a disadvantage when scheduling a test date. This delay often results in full testing sites, requiring the student to travel to find an open space, while their peers without disabilities can quickly identify and register at local locations. What can the NBME do to reduce or remove this barrier? And their response. Given that the USMLE Step exams are offered on a rolling basis year-round, this requirement should not create issues for most examinees, as they control when they register and obtain their testing window. As a practical matter, of course, because many of the accommodations provided to examinees require the exam to be given over multiple days and/or in a separate room, it is helpful to wait until a decision is made on an accommodation request so that the exam can be scheduled with the approved testing parameters.
Thank you, Grace. So we just wanted to point out that as of January 26, 2022, as many of you are already aware, the Step 1 exam is no longer scored numerically, but is now reported as pass-fail only. The Step 2 CK exam is, of course, still scored numerically, and the score range is 1 to 300. The minimum passing score for the Step 2C exam as of now, which is definitely subject to change, is a 214. And the average score in 2022 was a 247. So because the Step 1 exam is now scored pass-fail, many students have placed greater emphasis on their Step 2 CK performance, and there is some anticipation that residency programs may also place greater scrutiny than in years past on applicants' Step 2 CK exam scores. So yeah, I hope this helped provide a general overview of the exams. Please feel free to ask any questions at the end of the presentation, or you can also submit them using the Q&A feature. As a final note, I just wanted to encourage you all to look over the information on the USMLE website for the most up-to-date information. As indicated before, we've included some links in the chat, and we'll include a few additional links about the exam as well later on.
Awesome. Before moving on, I want to acknowledge that students have been reporting to DRPs that they're going to skip accommodations on Step 1 due to the pass-fail nature of the exam. Please note that the pass-fail nature of the exam doesn't change or impact the access to the exam. So for students who require more time to access questions or read questions, they'll continue to have barriers. These barriers are not removed simply by the switch to pass-fail, so the student could fail. Moreover, failure to establish the need for an accommodation on all exams could set the learner up for failure on future requests. Let's say a student decides to forego the accommodations for Step 1, passes, but we don't know by what margin because it's just reported as pass-fail, and in preparing for Step 2, realizes that they cannot pass without accommodations. When applying for the accommodations, that student will need to justify why they didn't request accommodations on Step 1 and how they were able to be successful, as it is a similar exam, and they didn't seek accommodations for that. Adding to this pressure is the shift from applying for accommodations when you're in a didactic portion of your coursework versus applying for them while you're in the full swing of clinical duties, arguably a more difficult time to manage the multiple pieces needed for a full and robust application.
The initial guide was created by Dr. Lisa Meeks and Dr. Neera Jain to support students, providers, and disability resource professionals, or DRPs, as we call them, in navigating the NBME accommodation request process at their prior institution, the University of California, San Francisco. It was shared with other DRPs as a resource and soon became the premier guide to assist both students and faculty. The guide offers a clear and shareable timeline for the accommodations process. It articulates how to present a strong application, supporting documentation, and it provides common reasons for denials. This framing allows students and providers to preemptively address items before they submit. Finally, the guide provides a roadmap and instructions for students to develop and craft robust personal statements. The guide is helpful for a variety of stakeholders. DRPs can use it as a roadmap with students regarding the USMLE accommodation request process, as it outlines the required steps and considerations in great detail, provides a checklist, and offers personal statement prompts. The guide can also be used to educate students, faculty, and staff on their roles in the process while emphasizing the timeline, which is arguably the most critical part of the process. As this level of support requires time and resources, the guide can also be used to highlight to leadership the need for robust documentation and to advocate for funding support for students to obtain new or updated documentation. This is especially important as students coming from underrepresented or under-resourced backgrounds may be less likely to be identified as having a disability than other student populations earlier in their life. Similarly, students can utilize the guide to understand their role in the process and develop a personal timeline based on their individual circumstances. Some students with well-documented histories of needing and receiving accommodations may have the required information readily available, while others will need time to gather the necessary documents and materials. As medical school becomes increasingly more time-consuming and hectic as they progress, starting the process during the first year might be required. For students requiring updated documentation, the guide can be used to assist providers with understanding the documentation requirements, which Grace will talk about here shortly.
As Aggie mentioned, by understanding the process, staff and administrators are more likely to advocate and/or support resources, such as a med school-specific DRP that can assist students in the process to request accommodations or finding funding for neuropsych evaluations. This guide will be exceptionally helpful to providers who may not be familiar or comfortable with providing the level of detail required for the USMLE Step Accommodation request process. In situations where providers prefer to be vague about specific diagnoses in an effort to protect the student's privacy, the guide can be helpful in identifying the level of information needed. For this reason, it can be helpful to provide on-campus counseling departments and other documenting providers a copy of the guide, which includes direct links to the specific NBME requirements by disability type, so they can understand the USMLE requirements. Furthermore, the guide can be helpful in emphasizing the importance of a strong, carefully phrased letter and provides prompts to assist providers in appropriately articulating the student's required accommodations.
So let's review the sections to the guide. The guide begins with a disclaimer from Drs. Meeks and Jane and a note about equity. Then it dives into some common myths and misconceptions about the NBME accommodations process. Additionally, the guide covers timelines, the personal statement, which will be covered in more detail in webinar 3, the average person standard or threshold of disability to receive accommodations, documentation requirements, support for provider letters, DRP letters of support, ancillary letters of support, available accommodations, and personal item exemptions. The guide also contains multiple appendices, which is where students, DRPs, and providers will find relevant timelines, checklists, letter prompts, and templates. The appendices are an area to highlight with all stakeholders, as they are highly useful tools in the process. They can be used as single-page resources for both students and providers.
All right, so beginning the process. So when should you begin this process? The guide suggests this process should begin at the initial intake meeting with the student. Although step one might feel very far away to the student at that time, that is also the time where the student will have the most free time and space for any retesting or testing needs early in their medical education. During the meeting, it's important for the DRP to emphasize that the institutional requirements for accommodations may differ from the NBMEs. As such, the DRP should review the student's documentation to highlight where gaps might exist or whether their current documentation will need to be updated prior to requesting step accommodations. During this process, it's important to check in with students to see if there might be any barriers to them obtaining or updating their documentation. Neuropsych exams can be costly and difficult to schedule. In situations where financial barriers exist, the DRP should connect with other medical school staff and administrators to understand what resource exists. In some cases, there might be internal scholarships, internal low or no cost testing through PhD programs in psychology, or testing may be available through your testing or learning centers. Because this type of testing can cost several $1,000s and might not be covered by insurance, another option is for the DRP to advocate for a financial aid increase to cover the cost of testing. This option would increase a student's loan package to cover the neuropsych testing needed for the accommodation process. When updated testing is needed, students will need to make time to call providers and schedule the evaluations. This means the students who require updated testing may need to start identifying financial resources and scheduling appointments for testing during their first year of medical school. Taken all together, you can see why it is critical for students to be aware of the NBME accommodation process as soon as possible.
So how can DRPs properly advise students through this process? What are some key elements that DRP should look for? DRPs should take a careful look at the documentation. The documentation or evaluation report should be completed by a qualified professional. The individual should have experience diagnosing and treating adults with that specific disability. Additionally, the professional should include their credentials, licenses, and information referencing their expertise in diagnosing and treating specific populations. The DRP should also review when documentation was completed and consider whether it will still be considered current by the NBME's stated standards at the time they will be submitting. Remember, this could be 2 years from the date that you're reviewing it. Generally speaking, the NBME requires documentation to be completed within the last 3 years, but more recent documentation may be required for disabilities with variable symptoms or for conditions that may change over time, such as psychological conditions. The DRP should also consider the quality of available documentation. Is the documentation comprehensive? What tests or measures were utilized in the report? Were the scores or measures included within the report or just referenced in the narrative? Is the severity, frequency, and duration of the disability mentioned? This is key information for the USMLE and one quite often requested by NBME Disability Services to fully consider a request. Did the examiner utilize the correct assessment tools to diagnose the student? For example, the NBME clearly states on their website that the Nelson-Denny reading test and wide range achievement test are not comprehensive diagnostic measures of achievement, and therefore neither is considered acceptable if used as the sole measure of reading ability or academic skills.
In the guide, there are useful and detailed examples of recommended documentation to include in the submission. I highly recommend emphasizing this section of the guide with students when reviewing the process. The NBME requests proof of prior accommodations. This can be recent, as in during medical school, or in other cases, more historical data, such as proof of accommodations in the K through 12 setting, during college or graduate school, or on standardized undergraduate and graduate admissions exams, including the SAT, ACT, or MCAT. There are also a couple of required items that students often miss in this process, specifically the certification of prior test accommodations, which is completed by the individual responsible for medical student disability services at the institution, and the request for test accommodations form, which should be completed by the student. These are required parts of the submission and cannot be overlooked, even if the student feels the questions were addressed in other areas of their submission. I want to pause again and acknowledge that just because a student didn't receive accommodations before, including on the MCAT, it does not mean they are ineligible for or would not receive accommodations on the STEP exams. This is a common myth and misconception. Students who did not receive accommodations prior to medical school, including on high stakes exams, should explain in their personal statement why, and to be sure to have documenting providers outline any changes in disability severity or the impact, as well as how their MCAT experience was adversely impacted due to the lack of accommodations. In fact, we have another NBME Q&A on that topic. So our question, the prevailing belief system of many students is that they will not receive accommodations for step 1 if they have a new diagnosis and no history of accommodation. Can you address these belief systems? And do you have recommendations for navigating the process for students who are newly diagnosed with a disability and who require accommodations to fully access the exam? For example, students diagnosed within 1 year of needing to take the step exam. And here is the response from the NBME. They said it is not correct that an examinee will not receive accommodations on the USMLE simply because they have been recently diagnosed and have no history of accommodations. Some disorders, such as certain psychiatric and medical disorders, are not developmental in nature and may not have impaired the examinee's functioning until recently. In these and all instances, it is important for examinees and their treating evaluating professionals to describe the examinee's disorder, symptom burden, functional limitations relative to taking the USMLE, and the need for the requested accommodations in a detailed and clear manner that is specific to the examinee and not just a list of generic symptoms from the DSM or ICD. Examinees are not expected to provide information that may be too personal in nature or would induce trauma responses in sharing, but it is helpful to have detailed information about the examinee's actual symptoms and how they currently impair the examinee's functioning. In the case of developmental disorders, such as learning disorders or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, even if the examinee was only recently diagnosed and has no history of accommodation, there should be some objective historical records of impairment, as this is part of the diagnostic criteria. And then the last part of their response was, we highly recommend that the examinees review NBME's guidelines for requesting testing accommodations and share those guidelines with their treating evaluating professional, as they are intended to guide examinees in identifying the type of documentation and information that is most useful in NBME's review. Regardless of when someone was diagnosed or what their history of accommodation may be, examinees should submit documentation which demonstrates that they have an impairment that substantially limits their ability to perform one or more major life activities that are relevant when taking an examination, like the USMLE Step Exams, as compared to most people in the general population. So in light of this guidance, what else, can a student submit? What else should they submit? Ancillary supporting documentation can be used to strengthen a student's request for accommodations, but remember, it can also weaken it, so be judicious. These documents can be letters from advisors, deans, professors, in particular those that might have made the referral to the disability office. It can also include letters from an academic support or learning specialist like Sue. These individuals are in a unique situation to observe the student's academic trajectory, as they may observe students struggling prior to accommodation, despite the fact that student clearly knew the material. For those students who have been formally employed, letters from former employers who granted accommodations in the workplace or who can share observations of disability-related difficulties might also be helpful in showing the full impact of the individual's disability. For students who might have been diagnosed later in life, it can be helpful to submit historical information that demonstrated missed signs of the disability. This includes report cards detailing behavior patterns, inattentiveness, or need for extra support. Past transcripts can help if they provide evidence of great improvements after being granted accommodations. And that is a key point, as transcripts and supplementary items should not be submitted if they do not add to the disability narrative. I also want to emphasize the value in reviewing the guide with your students, rather than simply emailing it to them if possible. In some cases, students may become overwhelmed by this section and may believe if they don't have report cards indicating inattentive behavior, that their submission is hopeless. I, like many DRPs, have been successful in obtaining accommodations using updated neuropsych evaluations or even initial neuropsych evaluations paired with really strong provider letters. Students might become easily deflated throughout this process. So be sure to review the facts and create space for them to process concerns and ask clarifying questions. Also remember that all of this work is happening at the same time as their adjustment to medical school, as we keep mentioning, the beginnings of their professional identity development, and at a time where they should be building social and professional networks. So every hour that they take to address this process is one that's taken away from them in other areas of development. As Dr. Meeks stated, this is a privileged process that's unfortunately inherently inequitable. Therefore, any supports that a student can be provided will help mitigate the negative impact on that student. You are a huge support to the learner, and we appreciate you for doing this work.
So what types of accommodations are available? Finally, we'll review the most commonly requested accommodations on USMLE Step Exams, the first of which is, not surprisingly, extended testing time. Extended testing time is granted in increments of 25%, 50%, or 100%. Additional break time is also a common accommodation request and refers to additional break time on top of the standard 45 minutes. Some students may request shortened test sections, wherein a student requires shorter test sections of 30 minutes versus the standard 60. This may be needed for students with chronic conditions that might require frequent breaks to address symptoms or use the restroom. Students granted additional test time must take the exam over 2 days. However, students can also request multi-day testing as its own accommodation. Although prometric spaces are ideally designed to be a lower distraction environment, students can also request testing in a private room. Students can also request use of assistive technology for their exams. Examples of commonly utilized assistive technology for STEP include speech-to-text or screen magnifying software such as Zoom Text. Specific requests for assistive technology should demonstrate a proficiency in using the technology and include how long the student has used that particular technology. There are some items that the NBME does not require prior approval for. These items are called personal item exemptions, and these specific items are documented in the guide, but up-to-date information about these items can be found on the NBME website, which is another link we will drop in the chat.
Right. Before turning things over to Dr. Meeks, I want to emphasize the importance of supporting students through this process. Despite many of my students being formally diagnosed for the first time in late undergrad or many of them in medical school, at DGSOM, we have an exceptionally high success rate for STEP accommodation requests. Over 98% of my students were either approved after appeal or after their initial submission. And this is because I have the privilege of being hired by the medical school as a specialized DRP, similar to Dr. Meeks and Dr. Jane's experiences. So to provide this high level of support and guiding students through the process, is imperative, and it makes an incredible difference to the students. And demonstrates that resources and guidance matter. A couple of quick reminders before the Q&A. Webinar 2 will be on October 5th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, and will focus on supporting providers as they develop documentation and recommendations for drafting meaningful letters of supports. And the third and final webinar will take place on October 18th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, and we'll go over how to assist students in writing compelling personal statements and provide an overview of the writing prompts from the updated guide. With that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Meeks.
Thank you so much. Such valuable information. And I really appreciate this team. Lots and lots of questions in the Q&A. And so we've been answering them as they've been coming in, but still plenty more. Really quickly, before we get to the questions, I just want to make sure that you're aware of all of the resources that'll be available to you. As I mentioned earlier, all of our resources are free and accessible. So if you are an individual working in the medical education space, the AIM program, Access in Medicine, is the premier program for DRPs and for faculty and leaders in medicine. We have a lot of resources coming out. There's a lot more in the way of resources, in the way of books and presentations and written material. And you'll also find that our research portion of the group is also developing a lot, and has published a ton on this topic and more, and will continue to publish in this area. So how can you find us? Well, you can go to the website at www.DocsWithDisabilities.org. You can go to our YouTube page, which many people have been asking if this is going to be recorded. It is going to be recorded. It'll take about a week. We want to make sure that we upload the recordings with captioning and with the ASL interpreters. But you can go to our YouTube page and subscribe, and you'll get notifications of anything that comes out. And we have several videos there for you to review. So it's a wealth of information. You can also follow us on Twitter. I refuse to call it X, at DocsWith. And you can find us now on Instagram, thanks to all of our amazing interns at DocsWithDisabilities. And so we're going to go ahead and go to Q&A now. And yep, perfect. So we have a lot of questions that are just coming in. So let's see. Does anyone know if the NBME requires the Prometric sites to enforce a standard level of noise reduction or provision of physical resources like appropriate tables, chairs, headsets that work, clocks to measure time in and out of checkout? I've heard from students experiencing adverse events, which leads me to wonder if there isn't standardization in this process. So, does anyone have, I know Prometrics had its tough times through our pandemic. I don't know if anyone has any information about this.
So I don't have like a specific response. I will say that, like the NBME, if you send them questions or call a Prometric center, they're exceptionally helpful. I think there are certain levels of standardization. When I was at Case, there was a Prometric center that was attached to the office. But you know, there's things that can occur. You know, they might run out of a certain number of things that are offered complimentary. So it's always good for the student, or you can call just to say, you know, are there earplugs available, or can they bring their own? You know, what is not permitted to be brought, you know, on their own, or what will you have there? But it's also important for the student, if they experience an adverse event, to address it that day, make somebody aware. Typically, like I had a situation where a student, the AC went out midway through the test and it was super, super hot that day. So they had the option to potentially stop the exam and take it a different time. And that's an important thing to talk about with the student, because if they continue to test and they feel like their results are reflective of that adverse, you know, there's not much you can do at that point. So I encourage students and DRPs to reach out, though. Prometric's great to work with.
And one of the things that I know I have suggested in the past is for the student to visit the Prometric Center before the actual test day, to ask questions, to run through. It's I think we were talking the other day and we said it's almost like the concept of flooding, like get in there, feel all the feels before you show up to take your exam. Wonderful. Someone is asking, they said they have students applying for accommodations now, and they're wondering if they could get an old copy of the USMLE guide. And because I have two screens going and I'm monitoring questions, I'm actually not able to put it in the chat. Is there anybody on the panel that could look that up and maybe post it to Sarah, and Sarah can post it to everyone else? But we certainly would be happy to share that. And I think it's on the Docs with Disabilities website as well.
Yeah. And Lisa, I just wanted to mention too, because of the example of, checking out a Prometric center, there's an option right now for $75. Students can also go to centers and actually take a practice exam at the Prometric center. So there's some weird stuff with accommodations they're still kind of navigating, but they're able to do some self-time pieces. So that could be a great option for the student.
I just wanted to add to that. Yeah, exactly, Grace. So and to say that students can absolutely do a trial run using the USMLE free interactive test. They can, once they've registered, they can actually go to the test center, take that practice test to feel it out. What I often tell students, there is variation in test sites. They operate kind of like a franchise where there are some standard conditions that have to be met, minimal ones, but I believe there is variation. So I've had students report, obviously because there are different buildings and structures, but also even with some of the interface, I had a student tell me that just the type of computers, they were slightly different from center to center. They had gone to different sites for step 1 and step 2 and noticed that difference. So there is some variation there, but highly recommend having students do that free interactive test at the testing center if they wish.
I agree. And, near and dear to my heart as a first gen from a disadvantaged background, I'm always thinking about the money. Know that most medical schools have these funds that are at the discretion of the dean, even if you don't know that they have these funds. So for something that's $75, that may be the difference between groceries and not having groceries for a week for a student. So just always be aware of the financial burden on students and try to, as the DRP or as a faculty member, try to avail yourself to all of the potential funding that's available. I also recommend that schools and DRPs work together to create what's called a go sheet in kind of the funding world, where you make an argument for people who want to donate money to your school and say, this is a this is a fund where we could really use some help, whether that's for psychoeducational assessments or for the $75 fee or something of that nature. So interesting, we have a question that I've never had before. Do you know if the NBME and MBOME would accept an accommodation decision from the other? And so, because for those of you who don't know, the MBOME is the agency that oversees DO schools, and they've actually been known to be a bit tougher than the NBME. So I guess the question is probably one of, if you get an accommodation on the NBME, could you use that as documentation or support? What do you guys think?
I always feel like I'm the first one to interject. So I, anytime a student receives accommodations on a high stake exam, I think it certainly helps strengthen their submission. And Lisa, you might be able to potentially comment on this from, I've not worked with DO schools, so have not had to work with the NBOME, but my understanding is that sometimes can be a much more difficult process. So I think you might be able to use something from the NBOME, more successfully with the NBME, but I'm not quite sure about the reverse.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I would say they're both independent organizations that make independent decisions, but in putting together a packet, I don't think that's something that would harm the decision. I will say that. I don't think it will work against you. I have a really good question, and I think all three of you can respond to this and add different layers. People are asking, and I think this makes a lot of sense. So many schools don't have a specialized DRP. They're still working kind of in partnership with their undergraduate disability resource office. So they don't have someone who's specialized in medicine, and they don't have someone that may be able to dedicate what I think is a pretty fair estimate of 10 to 12 hours per student to go through this process. So what they're asking is, what resources might you have, or what ideas might you have to help reduce the burden on students while not perpetuating the inequities of, the haves getting a consultant and the have-nots just not getting accommodations?
So I'm one of those DRPs that is connected to our undergraduate, like our main campus office. And I think part of it is being fully informed on the process. So as a DRP, knowing like what is the proper timeline, how do I advise students when I take a look at documentation in an intake meeting, like to have that initial preliminary conversation about whether or not, this meets the guidelines of what the NBME has established for step accommodation. So I think like that kind of being informed of all those things is useful, and you can be kind of a great resource for students in that. But I'll leave it up to see if Grace or Sue has anything else to add.
Lisa, can you repeat the question? I just wanted to make sure. I had some thoughts and I realized I wanted to make sure.
Sure. The individual was asking about ideas for helping reduce inequities for schools or for students that don't have a specialized DRP at the medical school.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know at UCLA, and I'm sure Grace can speak to this, prior to her coming, which we're so grateful to have you there, Grace, because she's made such amazing, done such amazing work with our students with disabilities who are applying for accommodations. Often a school, so whatever role you're in, if you work in as faculty, or I'm not sure in our audience, if we have folks who have different roles other than DRPs, I'm sure we do, to kind of work in partnership with folks there's usually like a learning support office or academic support office, and to try to kind of create partnerships and collaboration, both within the institution and across. And so, for example, prior to Grace's arrival and us hiring a DRP, in my role as Director of Academic Support, worked very closely with my counterparts and also our faculty to kind of create some awareness about the need for support and resources for our students with disabilities who were applying for accommodations. And then we also partnered with just to get some best practices and work with folks in other institutions to understand, what were some things that we could learn from what others are doing. And obviously webinars like this, it was so wonderful. I actually came across the accommodation packet that was just linked below from UCSF, and actually used that quite a bit in my own role as we were starting out working with students and helping them through the accommodations process. So definitely encourage you to utilize all those resources as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think
that's great advice.
Yeah, and I was just going to add too, like, if you can't do 12 hours per student, because it is a lot. Like I said, it's very much, I feel very privileged that I'm in a position to provide high touch support. But even, with my current caseload, that can be daunting and a lot. Offering opportunities to do mini asynchronous and or synchronous presentations to students where they can join anonymously, so they're not necessarily outing themselves, but they can learn about the process. You can emphasize, like, don't get disheartened by X, Y, and Z, like that's a myth or a misconception, and provide prompts and templates where appropriate and where you can. So one thing for students appealing, I worked with our student affairs dean to develop a template so he can plug and play important information for that student to support their appeal, without, kind of adding a ton of time that he doesn't necessarily have in his schedule. And I've done that for students as well. But I think the number one thing you can do with the inequity is to really address funding for neuropsychs, because as we said, under-resourced students coming from underrepresented backgrounds are far less likely to be identified before. So if we remove those barriers and have at least a system to kind of channel them through so they can get connected to a provider without this convoluted system and 6-month wait time, that can make an incredible difference.
Yeah, I would say some of the things that I've seen people do nationally that I love is when they can't do it one-on-one with the students, they'll offer workshops. So they'll offer a workshop on personal statement, a workshop on putting together your documentation where they'll have access to a scanner. I mean, just little things like a student having to go and find a place to scan all their documentation because the NBME requires one PDF. And just, kind of scaling the service, if you will. So it's not individual, but you can scale it up and provide protected time. The other thing that I've seen DRPs do, is provide regional support. So a couple of people, I don't know if they're on this webinar, but we have some friends in the Southeast region who have just done an incredible job of reaching out to undergraduate institutions that are supporting medical schools while they're specialized in the medical school and saying, hey, let's create a group, right? So we can provide each other support. And then as part of that support, they provide kind of an overview or a little bit of mentoring on the USMLE and NBME process. So I think that's really, really helpful. And we have about 3 minutes left. So I just want to peek over. I know that there were a lot of questions about accessibility of the Step 1 and Step 2 exams for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so is there a general response to that? And this is obviously with response to the very few questions that have an audio component. And how is that handled during testing? And for those questions, while Grace is preparing, for those questions that we didn't get to, we are capturing all of the questions. We have already recognized the need for probably a webinar that would be a questions and answers, where we take all of your questions and we kind of roll them up into themes and we address these questions. Not only address all the questions that you have, but it allows us to go back to our partners at the NBME and have them weigh in as well, and then bring in some other experts as needed, because we have lots of friends out there in the audience. So hi to all of those people I'm seeing pop up.
Yeah, so for the question regarding a deaf or hard of hearing student, and I'm probably the individuals had one most recently. Again, it's always helpful to call, reach out to the Prometric Center. But that's part of the reason we had Sue cover the format of the questions, because I've had students arrive and they didn't ask for anything related to audio components. So some of that is not inherently built in and a request needs to be made. So either through technology or a reader, or I'm sorry, captioning or something, to add that piece of it. So it's important for students to indicate if there are any videos, if they're going to need it to be accessible.
Oh, that's a great point, Grace. I wanted to point out, because I know with our institution, students may not be used to that process of realizing that they actually have to be very specific with the type of request that they need for accommodations, and that requires them being familiar with the format and the needs and the requirements, audio visual, of the exam. Because, for example, at UCLA, students will submit their request for accommodations in their institution, and oftentimes the institution or the body that's responsible for that at UCLA, it's the Center for Accessible Education, will then tell the student, this is what you are eligible based on our assessment to receive. There is an interactive process, but oftentimes that burden falls on the institution, whereas for USMLE exams, oftentimes students have to be aware of what the need is. And, if they don't have a DRP, that can be very, very obviously fraught with uncertainty, because they don't know what they need if they don't know what the format of the exam, or they're not familiar with the format and the requirements of the exam. So that's super important to be aware of.
Well, just a few things in closing. Thank you. Thanks to our panelists who created this content, helped to bring the guide that's coming to you alive. The guide is now with our student ambassadors who are reviewing it. They're an important group, and we want their feedback before bringing it to the general public. And then also our book, we received the copyright back for our book, and in an effort to make sure that we are providing information in an accessible and equitable way. So you can now download this book for free, and that information was put on the chat. We will be sending out a brief survey. Please do fill it out. Your feedback to us is really important. It helps us as we start to go through the iterative process for webinar 2 and 3. It will also help us decide and define what a webinar 4 would look like. So we have all of your questions. Again, thank you for the really hard work that you do. Thank you for showing up here and spending an hour with us and dedicating your time to assisting the students. We appreciate you, and we hope that you'll be able to find all the resources you need on the Docs with Disabilities Initiative website. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out through the website, and we'll be happy to get back with you. And rest assured, your questions will come up in some format, most likely a webinar 4. But thank you and have a wonderful evening.